The waiter was fired for paying an elderly woman's bill, but when her millionaire husband arrived, the soft glow of candlelight flickered across the crisp white tablecloths of Le Chateau, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the heart of New York City. The gentle clink of fine china and the muted murmur of conversation created an atmosphere of refined elegance that seemed a world away from the bustling city streets outside. Jack Sullivan, a waiter in his late 20s, moved gracefully between the tables, his crisp black uniform a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Despite the air of luxury, Jack's mind was elsewhere. The weight of unpaid bills and mounting debts pressed heavily on his shoulders, a burden he carried silently as he catered to the whims of New York's elite. As he approached table 17, Jack's attention was drawn to its sole occupant, an elderly woman, perhaps in her early 80s, with silver hair elegantly coiffed and a pair of pearl earrings that caught the light as she turned her head. Her deep blue eyes, though slightly clouded with age, held a spark of vitality that immediately struck Jack. "Good evening, madam," Jack said, offering a warm smile. "My name is Jack, and I'll be your server tonight. May I start you off with something to drink?" The woman looked up, a flicker of confusion passing over her face before it was replaced by a gentle smile. "Oh, yes, thank you, dear. I'll have a glass of white wine, please. The house Chardonnay will do nicely." As Jack jotted down the order, he couldn't help but notice the woman's slightly trembling hands as she reached for the menu. There was something about her demeanor, a mix of dignity and vulnerability, that tugged at his heartstrings. "Of course, madam. I'll be right back with your wine, and when I return, I'd be happy to go over our specials for the evening." As Jack made his way to the bar to fetch the wine, he overheard snippets of conversation from his colleagues. "Table 17 again," muttered Sarah, one of the senior waitresses. "Third time this month she's come in alone. Always orders the same thing, always seems a bit lost." Jack's curiosity was piqued. "You know her?" Sarah shrugged. "Not really, just that she's Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne. Used to be a regular with her husband, big shot Wall Street type. Haven't seen him in ages, though." With the glass of Chardonnay in hand, Jack returned to Mrs. Hawthorne's table. As he approached, he noticed her staring intently at the menu, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Here's your wine, Mrs. Hawthorne," Jack said gently, placing the glass on the table. "Would you like me to tell you about our specials this evening?" Mrs. Hawthorne looked up, a flash of relief crossing her features. "Oh yes, please. I seem to have forgotten my reading glasses." Jack's heart went out to her. With patience and care, he detailed the evening's offerings, taking extra time to describe each dish. As he spoke, he noticed Mrs. Hawthorne relaxing, the tension in her shoulders easing. "The roasted salmon with dill sauce sounds lovely," she said finally. "I think I'll have that." As the evening progressed, Jack found himself drawn more and more to Mrs. Hawthorne's table. Between his other duties, he would stop by, refilling her water glass or simply checking if she needed anything. Their conversations, though brief, revealed glimpses of a life filled with fascinating experiences. Travels around the world, a career as a concert pianist, and a long, happy marriage. But there was something else, too. A sadness that seemed to hover just beneath the surface, a loneliness that Jack recognized all too well. It reminded him of his own grandmother, who had passed away a few years ago, leaving a void that still ached. As the restaurant began to empty and the hour grew late, Jack brought Mrs. Hawthorne her check. He watched with growing concern as she fumbled in her purse, a look of distress clouding her features. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Jack asked softly. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I seem to have forgotten my wallet," she whispered, her voice quivering with embarrassment. "I could have sworn I put it in my purse before I left home. Oh dear, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me lately." In that moment, Jack made a decision that would change the course of his life. Without hesitation, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out his wallet. "Please, Mrs. Hawthorne, don't worry about it. Dinner's on me tonight." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." "I insist," Jack said firmly, already pulling out his credit card. "It's my pleasure." As he walked away to process the payment, Jack's mind raced. He knew he couldn't really afford this. The bill was more than he made in 2 days of work. But the thought of Mrs. Hawthorne's distress, the idea of her feeling humiliated or possibly getting into trouble, was more than he could bear. What Jack didn't notice, as he was lost in his thoughts, was the sharp gaze of Marcus Steinberg, the restaurant's manager, following his every move. As Jack returned to the table with the receipt, Mrs. Hawthorne reached out and grasped his hand. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your kindness, it means more than you know." Jack smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "It's nothing, Mrs. Hawthorne. I'm just glad I could help." As he helped Mrs. Hawthorne with her coat and watched her make her way slowly out of the restaurant, Jack felt a mixture of emotions: concern for this elegant, vulnerable woman, satisfaction at having done something genuinely good, and a nagging worry about how he was going to make ends meet this month. Little did Jack know that his act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would turn his world upside down. As he turned to begin clearing the table, he heard Marcus Steinberg's cold voice behind him. "Sullivan, my office." Now, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, Jack followed the manager to the small, cluttered office at the back of the restaurant. He had a feeling this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Steinberg settled behind his desk, his face a mask of disapproval. "Would you care to explain what just happened out there?" Jack straightened his shoulders, determined to stand by his decision. "Mrs. Hawthorne forgot her wallet. I couldn't bear to see her embarrassed or in trouble, so I paid for her meal. It won't happen again, sir." Steinberg's eyes narrowed. "You're damn right it won't happen again. Do you have any idea how many rules you've broken? We are not a charity, Sullivan. If customers can't pay, we call the police. End of story." "But sir," Jack protested, "Mrs. Hawthorne is a regular customer. Surely we can make an exception." "Enough," Steinberg snapped. "I've had enough of your bleeding heart nonsense. You're fired, Sullivan. Clear out your locker and get out." Jack stood there, stunned. "Fired? But I was just trying to help." Steinberg was already turning his attention to some paperwork on his desk. "Not my problem. You can collect your final paycheck next week. Now get out of my restaurant." In a daze, Jack made his way to the employee locker room. As he changed out of his uniform for the last time, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was jobless, with a mountain of bills to pay and now an extra expense he couldn't afford. But even as panic threatened to overwhelm him, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. The memory of Mrs. Hawthorne's grateful eyes and trembling hands steeled his resolve. As Jack stepped out into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He had no idea what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing for certain. He had done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Little did Jack know that his act of kindness had not gone unnoticed, and that the consequences of his decision were about to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. As he walked down the street, lost in thought, a sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb in front of Le Chateau. The back door opened, and an elegantly dressed man in his mid-80s stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the restaurant entrance with a look of concern. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the lives of everyone involved, all because of one waiter's simple act of compassion. As Jack Sullivan trudged down the sidewalk, his mind reeling from the sudden loss of his job, he was oblivious to the elegant figure emerging from the limousine behind him. The man who stepped onto the curb was Charles Hawthorne, a titan of Wall Street and one of New York's most influential power brokers. Despite his 85 years, Charles cut an imposing figure. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his bespoke suit spoke of wealth and influence, and his piercing blue eyes, the same shade as his wife's, scanned the street with a sharpness that belied his age. But tonight, those eyes were clouded with worry. Charles had received a call from the maitre at Le Chateau, informing him that his wife had once again wandered off to the restaurant alone. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and each occurrence sent a spike of fear through Charles's heart. Eleanor's increasing forgetfulness and confusion were a source of constant concern for him, a battle they were fighting together against the creeping shadows of dementia. As Charles strode towards the restaurant entrance, his personal assistant, a young woman named Sarah Chen, hurried to keep up with him. Mr. Hawthorne, Sarah said, her voice low and urgent. I've just received word from the restaurant manager. There's been an incident with Mrs. Hawthorne. Charles stopped short, his hand on the door. What kind of incident? He demanded, his voice sharp with concern. Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It seems Mrs. Hawthorne forgot her wallet. A waiter paid for her meal, but the manager, well, he fired the waiter for it. Charles's expression darkened. Without another word, he pushed open the door and swept into the restaurant, leaving Sarah to trail in his wake. Inside, the restaurant was nearly empty, the last few patrons finishing their meals in the muted lighting. Marcus Steinberg, alerted to Charles Hawthorne's arrival, hurried over, his face a mask of obsequious concern. Mr. Hawthorne, Steinberg said, bowing slightly. I'm so relieved you're here. I hope Mrs. Hawthorne made it home safely. Charles fixed Steinberg with a steely gaze. My wife is fine. No thanks to your establishment's handling of the situation. I understand you fired a waiter for showing basic human decency? Steinberg's smile faltered. Sir, I assure you it was a matter of policy. We can't have staff. Enough. Charles interrupted, his voice cold. I want to speak to this waiter, immediately. Steinberg paled. I'm afraid he's already left, sir, but I can assure you we've dealt with the situation. The situation, Charles said, his voice rising, was my wife, a loyal patron of this restaurant for over 3 decades, finding herself in a moment of distress, and instead of being treated with compassion, she was nearly humiliated, saved only by the kindness of a young man who was then punished for his actions. Is this how Le Chateau treats its customers, Mr. Steinberg? By now, the remaining patrons were openly staring, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Steinberg, realizing the precariousness of his position, began to stammer out apologies. Mr. Hawthorne, please, if you'll just come to my office, I'm sure we can sort this out. Sort it out? Charles's voice was quiet now, but filled with a cold fury that made Steinberg flinch. Oh, we'll sort it out all right. You're going to tell me everything about this waiter, his name, his address, everything, and then you're going to rehire him with a substantial raise and a formal apology. Is that clear? Steinberg nodded frantically, already reaching for his employee files. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Right away. As Steinberg scurried off to fetch the information, Charles turned to Sarah. Find this young man, he said, his voice softening slightly. Bring him to the house tomorrow morning. I want to thank him personally for looking after Eleanor. Sarah nodded, already tapping away on her tablet. Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. I'll take care of it right away. Meanwhile, several blocks away, Jack Sullivan was sitting on a bench in Central Park, trying to make sense of the whirlwind that had just upended his life. The cool night air did little to calm the turmoil in his mind. How was he going to pay his rent now? What about his student loans? And worst of all, how could he face his mother and tell her he'd lost yet another job? As he sat there, head in his hands, he didn't notice the figure approaching until a soft voice broke into his thoughts. Excuse me, are you Jack Sullivan? Jack looked up to see a young woman in a smart business suit standing before him, a tablet clutched in her hands. Yes, he said warily. Who's asking? The woman smiled, extending her hand. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm the personal assistant to Charles Hawthorne. He would very much like to speak with you. Jack blinked, confusion written across his face. Charles Hawthorne? I'm sorry, I don't understand. Who is Charles Hawthorne? Sarah's smile widened slightly. He's Eleanor Hawthorne's husband, the woman whose dinner you paid for tonight. Jack's eyes widened in surprise. Mrs. Hawthorne's husband, but why would he want to speak with me? Mr. Hawthorne is very grateful for your kindness towards his wife, Sarah explained. He'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning if you're available, at his home. Jack's mind reeled. The events of the evening seemed to be spiraling further and further out of his control. I suppose I'm available, he said slowly, considering I'd just lost my job and all. Sarah's expression softened with sympathy. Mr. Hawthorne is aware of that situation and he's not pleased with how you were treated. I think you'll find that tomorrow's meeting will be very much to your advantage, Mr. Sullivan. As Sarah gave him the details for the meeting, Jack felt a glimmer of hope begin to spark in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, his impulsive act of kindness hadn't been the disaster it had initially seemed. The next morning found Jack standing outside an imposing townhouse on the Upper East Side, his palms sweaty as he straightened his tie, the only one he owned, hastily ironed this morning. He had spent a sleepless night wondering what this meeting could possibly be about, his mind conjuring scenarios ranging from wildly optimistic to deeply paranoid. Before he could work up the courage to ring the bell, the door swung open, revealing Sarah Chen's friendly face. "Mr. Sullivan, right on time. Please, come in. Mr. Hawthorne is expecting you." Jack followed Sarah through a foyer that was larger than his entire apartment, trying not to gape at the obvious signs of wealth surrounding him. Priceless artworks adorned the walls, and the plush carpet beneath his feet probably cost more than he made in a year, or used to make. He reminded himself with a pang. Sarah led him to a study that looked like something out of a movie, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound books. Seated behind a massive desk was a distinguished-looking older man who could only be Charles Hawthorne. Beside him, to Jack's surprise, sat Mrs. Hawthorne, looking far more composed than she had the previous night. Charles Hawthorne stood as Jack entered, extending his hand. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice warm but authoritative. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." As Jack sank into a leather armchair that probably cost more than his car, he felt a mixture of awe and nervousness. What could these incredibly wealthy people possibly want with him? Charles Hawthorne settled back into his chair, fixing Jack with a penetrating gaze. "Mr. Sullivan, I want to thank you for your kindness to my wife last night. In a world where it's all too easy to look the other way, you chose to help a stranger in need. That speaks volumes about your character." Jack felt his face flush with embarrassment. "It was nothing, sir. Really, I just did what anyone would do." "But that's just it," Eleanor Hawthorne spoke up, her voice gentle. "Not anyone would do what you did. You showed me kindness and dignity when I was feeling lost and confused. You have no idea how much that meant to me." Charles nodded, his expression softening as he looked at his wife. "Eleanor has been dealing with some health issues lately," he explained, turning back to Jack. "Early-stage dementia. It's been challenging, to say the least. Your act of kindness gave her a moment of peace in what has been a very difficult time for us." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Mrs. Hawthorne. I had no idea." Eleanor smiled, reaching out to pat Jack's hand. "Of course you didn't, dear, but you treated me with respect and compassion anyway. That's what matters." Charles cleared his throat, leaning forward slightly. "Now, Mr. Sullivan, I understand you lost your job because of your actions last night." Jack nodded, the memory of his firing still fresh and painful. "Yes, sir. The manager didn't approve of me paying a customer's bill." Charles's expression hardened slightly. "Yes, I've had words with the management at Le Chateau about that. Rest assured, their policies will be changing, but more importantly, I want to make things right for you." Jack's heart began to race. What did that mean? "I've looked into your background, Mr. Sullivan," Charles continued. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to understand the young man who showed such kindness to my wife. I understand you're working as a waiter to pay off student loans from your business degree?" Jack nodded, wondering where this was going. Charles smiled, a twinkle in his eye. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, how would you like to put that degree to use? I find myself in need of a new personal assistant, someone with integrity, compassion, and a good head for business. The job comes with a substantial salary, full benefits, and a signing bonus that should take care of those student loans." "What do you say?" Jack sat there, stunned. Was this really happening? A job offer from one of New York's most powerful businessmen, all because he'd paid for an old lady's dinner? As the implications of the offer began to sink in, Jack felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline, a chance to turn his entire life around. And all because he'd followed his instincts and shown kindness to a stranger in need. With tears in his eyes and a lump in his throat, Jack managed to speak. "Mr. Hawthorne, I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much. I would be honored to accept." As Charles Hawthorne stood to shake Jack's hand, sealing the deal, Jack couldn't help but marvel at the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. He had gone from unemployed and desperate to having a dream job in the span of less than 24 hours, all because of one simple act of kindness. Little did Jack know that this was just the beginning. His life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined, and his journey with the Hawthorns was only just beginning. As he left the townhouse that morning, his head spinning with the possibilities that now lay before him, Jack Sullivan had no idea of the adventures, challenges, and profound life lessons that awaited him in his new role. The waiter who had been fired for an act of kindness was about to embark on a new chapter of his life, one that would test his values, challenge his assumptions, and ultimately lead him to discover strengths he never knew he possessed. And it all started with a simple decision to help an elderly woman in need. The weeks following Jack Sullivan's unexpected career change were a whirlwind of activity. He found himself thrust into a world so different from his previous life that at times it felt like he had stepped into an alternate reality. The plush offices of Hawthorne Enterprises were a far cry from the bustling kitchen of Le Chateau, and Jack often caught himself marveling at the turn his life had taken. Charles Hawthorne proved to be a demanding but fair boss. He expected excellence from his staff, but he also rewarded hard work and initiative. Jack threw himself into his new role with enthusiasm, determined to prove that Charles's faith in him wasn't misplaced. One crisp autumn morning, about a month into his new job, Jack found himself in Charles's office for their daily briefing. "Jack," Charles began, his tone serious, "I have a special assignment for you. It's of a more personal nature." Jack leaned forward, intrigued. "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. How can I help?" Charles sighed, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his usually composed features. "It's about Eleanor, her condition. It's not improving. The doctors are recommending we hire a full-time caregiver, but Eleanor is resistant to the idea. She values her independence." Jack nodded, remembering the proud woman he had met at the restaurant. "I can understand that, sir." "Indeed," Charles continued. "Which is why I have a proposition. Would you be willing to take on some additional responsibilities? Act as a sort of companion to Eleanor when I'm tied up with work? It would involve accompanying her on outings, helping her with daily tasks, that sort of thing." Jack felt a mixture of surprise and honor at the request. "I'd be happy to help in any way I can, Mr. Hawthorne. Mrs. Hawthorne was kind to me, and I'd like to return the favor." Charles's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Jack. Your kindness continues to impress me. We'll adjust your compensation accordingly, of course." And so, Jack's role expanded once again. He found himself splitting his time between the corporate world of Hawthorne Enterprises and the more personal realm of the Hawthorne family's private life. At first, Eleanor was hesitant about Jack's increased presence in her daily routine. "I don't need a babysitter," she had declared firmly when Charles introduced the idea. But Jack's gentle demeanor and genuine care soon won her over. He had a knack for making her feel respected and valued, never patronizing her or drawing attention to her moments of confusion. Their outings became a highlight for both of them. Jack would accompany Eleanor to art galleries, concerts, and her favorite cafes. He learned to recognize the signs when she was feeling overwhelmed or disoriented, and developed subtle ways to help her regain her composure without embarrassment. One sunny afternoon, as they strolled through Central Park after visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Eleanor turned to Jack with a wistful smile. "You know, Jack," she said, her voice soft with memory, "Charles and I used to walk through this park every Sunday when we were first married. He was just a junior analyst then, with big dreams and empty pockets. We'd save up all week to buy hot dogs from the cart over there." She pointed to a vendor in the distance. Jack smiled, picturing a young Charles and Eleanor, full of hope and love. "That sounds wonderful, Mrs. Hawthorne. Would you like to get a hot dog for old time's sake?" Eleanor's eyes lit up. "Oh, could we? Charles worries so much about my diet these days, but one hot dog won't hurt, will it?" As they sat on a park bench enjoying their impromptu snack, Jack couldn't help but feel a wave of affection for this elegant, vulnerable woman. She had lived such a full life, and even now, in the face of a devastating illness, she maintained a spark of joy and mischief. But not all days were so pleasant. There were times when Eleanor's confusion would take a darker turn, leaving her frightened and agitated. On one particularly difficult evening, Jack received an urgent call from Charles, who was stuck in a late meeting. "Eleanor's having a bad episode," Charles explained, his voice tight with worry. "The housekeeper can't calm her down, Can you go to the house? You seem to have a way with her." Jack rushed to the Hawthorne residence, his heart pounding. He found Eleanor in the living room, pacing back and forth, her eyes wild with fear. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Jack said gently, approaching her slowly. "It's Jack. You're safe. Everything's okay." Eleanor whirled to face him, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering panic. "Jack? Oh, thank goodness. I couldn't remember. I thought I was somewhere else, somewhere bad." Jack guided her to the couch, speaking in soothing tones. "You're home, Mrs. Hawthorne. You're safe. Let's sit down and take some deep breaths together, okay?" As he helped Eleanor through her breathing exercises, Jack felt a deep sadness for this brilliant woman being betrayed by her own mind. But he also felt a fierce determination to do whatever he could to make her life easier, to bring her moments of peace and joy whenever possible. When Charles arrived home later that night, he found Jack and Eleanor in the study. Eleanor was asleep on the couch, looking peaceful for the first time in hours, while Jack sat nearby, keeping a watchful eye on her. "Thank you, Jack," Charles said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Jack simply nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. He was glad he could help, but the weight of responsibility was sometimes overwhelming. He was no longer just an employee. He had become an integral part of the Hawthornes' lives, privy to their most vulnerable moments. As the months passed, Jack's bond with the Hawthornes deepened. He became not just Charles's right-hand man at work, but a trusted confidant in their personal lives as well. He was there for the good days, when Eleanor would regale him with stories of her past adventures, her eyes sparkling with memory. And he was there for the bad days, when the fog of confusion would descend, leaving her frightened and lost. But as Jack became more entrenched in the Hawthornes' world, he found himself facing unexpected challenges. The lines between professional and personal began to blur, and he sometimes struggled to maintain appropriate boundaries. There were whispers among some of the other employees at Hawthorne Enterprises. Some saw Jack's rapid rise and close relationship with the family as evidence of opportunism. Others speculated about the nature of his relationship with Eleanor, unable to understand the deep but platonic affection that had developed between them. Jack did his best to ignore the gossip, focusing instead on his work and on helping the Hawthornes navigate this difficult chapter in their lives. But he couldn't deny that the situation was becoming increasingly complex. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the office, followed by a challenging episode with Eleanor, Jack found himself sitting alone in his small apartment, feeling the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. He thought about his old life. The simplicity of waiting tables, the clear delineation between work and personal time. For a moment, he allowed himself to wonder if he had taken on more than he could handle. But then, he remembered Eleanor's smile when he helped her remember a cherished memory, and Charles's grateful handshake after a successful business deal. He thought of the trust they had placed in him and the opportunity they had given him to make a real difference in their lives. With a deep breath, Jack squared his shoulders. He had chosen this path with all its complexities and challenges. And despite the difficulties, he knew in his heart that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Little did Jack know that his resolve was about to be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. The delicate balance he had struck between his professional duties and his personal involvement with the Hawthornes was about to be shaken to its core. As he drifted off to sleep that night, exhausted but determined, Jack Sullivan had no idea of the storm that was brewing on the horizon. A situation that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about loyalty, ethics, and the true meaning of family. The storm that had been brewing in Jack Sullivan's life broke with a suddenness that left him reeling. It began on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning as Jack arrived at the Hawthorne Enterprises offices, his mind already racing with the day's tasks. As he stepped off the elevator, he immediately sensed something was amiss. The usual buzz of activity was muted, replaced by hushed conversations and worried glances. Before Jack could inquire about the strange atmosphere, Sarah Chen, Charles's other assistant, rushed up to him, her face pale with concern. "Jack, thank goodness you're here," she said, her voice low and urgent. "There's been an emergency. Mr. Hawthorne had a heart attack last night. He's in the hospital. Jack felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. What? Is he okay? Sarah shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. It's touch and go. Mrs. Hawthorne is with him now. But Jack, that's not all. The board is in an uproar. There are rumors. Before she could finish, Jack's phone rang. It was Eleanor Hawthorne. Jack, her voice came through, shaky but determined. I need you at the hospital right away. There's something important we need to discuss. The next few hours passed in a blur. Jack rushed to the hospital, his mind whirling with worry for Charles and confusion about what could be so urgent. When he arrived at the private wing where Charles was being treated, he found Eleanor waiting for him, looking pale but composed. Jack, she said, gesturing for him to sit beside her. Charles is stable for now, but the doctors aren't sure. Her voice trailed off, and she took a moment to collect herself. There's something you need to know. Something Charles and I have been discussing for a while now. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick envelope. This contains legal documents. Charles has named you as interim CEO of Hawthorne Enterprises in the event of his incapacitation. Jack stared at her in disbelief. What? But that's impossible. I've only been with the company for a few months. Surely there are others more qualified. Eleanor shook her head firmly. Charles trusts you, Jack. He believes in your integrity and your vision. He's been grooming you for this, though you might not have realized it. As the implications of this news began to sink in, Jack felt a wave of panic. Mrs. Hawthorne, I don't know if I can do this. The responsibility. Eleanor reached out and grasped his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Jack, listen to me. Charles and I have come to think of you as family. We've seen your character, your kindness, your business acumen. You can do this. You must do this. Before Jack could respond, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Victor Prescott, the CFO of Hawthorne Enterprises and a longtime board member, burst into the room, his face flushed with anger. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, waving a document similar to the one Eleanor had just handed Jack. Charles can't possibly be serious about making this former waiter the interim CEO. Eleanor stood, drawing herself up to her full height. Despite her frail appearance, there was steel in her voice. That is exactly what Charles has decided, Victor, and as his wife and largest shareholder, I fully support his decision. Victor's face contorted with rage. This is absurd. The board will never stand for it. We'll challenge this legally if we have to. As Victor stormed out, promising a fight, Jack turned to Eleanor, his head spinning. Mrs. Hawthorne, maybe Mr. Prescott is right. Maybe this isn't a good idea. But Eleanor's gaze was unwavering. Jack, there's something else you should know. We've suspected for some time that there's been some financial irregularities within the company. Charles was investigating quietly. We believe Victor might be involved. That's one of the reasons Charles wants you in this position. You're not part of the old guard. You can see things with fresh eyes. The next few weeks were the most challenging of Jack's life. By day, he grappled with the monumental task of leading one of New York's largest corporations, facing skepticism and outright hostility from some board members and executives. By night, he spent hours at Charles's bedside, discussing strategy in whispered conversations as the older man's strength gradually returned. The investigation into the financial irregularities became Jack's top priority. With the help of a trusted team, including Sarah Chen, he began to unravel a complex web of embezzlement and fraud that reached to the highest levels of the company. As Jack delved deeper into the investigation, he found himself facing moral dilemmas he had never anticipated. There were moments when he was tempted to look the other way, to take the easy path. The stress began to take its toll, and there were nights when he lay awake, questioning whether he was truly up to the task. But in those moments of doubt, Jack would remember the kindness Charles and Eleanor had shown him, the trust they had placed in him. He thought of his own parents, who had raised him to value integrity above all else, and he found the strength to push forward, to do what was right, no matter the cost. The climax came on a rainy Friday afternoon, 3 months after Charles's heart attack. Jack stood before the board of directors, his heart pounding, but his voice steady as he presented the findings of his investigation. The evidence was irrefutable. Victor Prescott and several other high-ranking executives had been siphoning millions of dollars from the company for years. The room erupted in chaos as Jack finished his presentation. Victor Prescott leapt to his feet, shouting denials and threats. But Jack stood his ground, calmly presenting document after document, witness statement after witness statement. In the end, it was Charles Hawthorne himself who silenced the room. Having regained much of his strength, he had insisted on attending this crucial meeting. As he rose slowly to his feet, leaning on a cane, the room fell silent. "Gentlemen," Charles said, his voice weak but clear, "I have listened to Mr. Sullivan's presentation, and I have reviewed the evidence myself. I stand fully behind his findings and his recommendations. Those involved in this fraud will be turned over to the authorities, and Hawthorne Enterprises will undergo a complete restructuring to ensure this can never happen again." He turned to Jack, a proud smile on his face. "And I can think of no one better to lead us through this challenging time than Jack Sullivan. His integrity, his business acumen, and his unwavering commitment to doing what's right are exactly what this company needs. Therefore, I am appointing him as the permanent CEO of Hawthorne Enterprises, effective immediately." The weeks and months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Jack oversaw the restructuring of the company, working tirelessly to restore its reputation and financial stability. Under his leadership, Hawthorne Enterprises not only recovered from the scandal, but emerged stronger, with a new commitment to ethical business practices that became a model for the industry. But for Jack, the most meaningful moments were not the business triumphs, but the quieter, personal ones. The pride in Charles's eyes as he watched Jack lead the company he had built. The joy on Eleanor's face as her condition stabilized under a new treatment program Jack had helped research. The realization that he had not just found a job, but a family and a purpose. 1 year to the day after Jack had paid for Eleanor's dinner at Le Chateau, he found himself back at the restaurant. But this time, he wasn't there as a waiter. He was hosting a celebration dinner for the Hawthorne Enterprises team, marking a year of transformative change. As he stood to make a toast, Jack's eyes met those of Marcus Steinberg, the manager who had fired him a year ago. Steinberg looked away quickly, embarrassment clear on his face. But Jack felt no anger, only a sense of how far he had come. "A year ago," Jack began, his voice carrying across the silent restaurant, "I stood in this very room, a waiter unsure of his future. Today, I stand before you as the CEO of Hawthorne Enterprises. But more importantly, I stand here as a man who has learned the true value of kindness, integrity, and perseverance." He raised his glass, looking around at the faces of those who had become not just colleagues but friends. His gaze lingered on Charles and Eleanor Hawthorne, who beamed at him with parental pride. "To second chances," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "To the power of small acts of kindness. And to the family we choose, who lift us up and help us become the best versions of ourselves." As the room echoed with the sound of clinking glasses and warm applause, Jack Sullivan felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. The journey that had begun with a simple act of compassion had led him to a life he could never have imagined. He had faced challenges, confronted his fears, and emerged stronger for it. But more than the professional success or the personal growth, Jack was grateful for the relationships he had formed. The Hawthornes had become the family he never knew he needed. And in helping them, he had found his true calling. As the evening wore on, filled with laughter and celebration, Jack knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, he was ready to face them. For he had learned the most valuable lesson of all: that true wealth lies not in money or power, but in the lives we touch and the difference we make in the world. The waiter who had been fired for an act of kindness had become a leader who would change countless lives for the better. And it had all started with a simple decision: to help an elderly woman in need. As Jack looked around at the life he had built, he silently thanked the twist of fate that had brought him to this moment, and pledged to always remember the power of compassion and the importance of doing what's right, no matter the cost.